So welcome. My name is Peter Clement. I'm the interim director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And I want to thank you for coming today. This is a very nice turnout at a busy time of the semester. And I know we have actually a large number of people viewing this online. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm especially delighted to have Gary Sick here today for a number of personal reasons. For those of you who know me, I spent most of my career in CIA, and I was a very young analyst. We were just talking about this when Gary was already a muckety-muck at the National Security Council working on Middle East affairs.
Also very young.
Very, yeah, very young. And just literally 2 weeks ago, I'm reading the New York Times, and I'm hoping you all are still reading newspapers, either online or in print. I like the print version. And I'm reading this article about the October surprise of 1980, and I immediately said, oh my God, I'm sure Gary is either in the article or he's read the article. So lo and behold, he is citing the article. And so I was talking to Ingrid, who runs the Saltzman Institute, and we both said, what a great idea. Maybe we should talk to Gary and see if he'd be willing to speak more about this whole controversy and the October surprise. For those of you of a younger age cohort, I'm hoping you all know what October surprise is, correct? It's become so commonplace now, particularly with recent elections. And as I'm getting a little bit older myself, I'm realizing this whole October surprise thing has been going on for a long, long time. It didn't just happen in 2016 or even 1980. It's been going on for quite a while. So as I'm going through the article,
It's now a tradition.
it is. People are, yeah, all campaigns are paranoid, as we saw in 2016, but also even in 2020. That some great horrible revelation will emerge that's going to affect the outcome of the election. So I'm reading this article, and the thing I really loved about it is I like when you can talk to people who were witnesses to history. I was there when it happened, and the guy the story is about is 98 years old. He's in hospice, but he was there in 1979 and 1980, wandering around in 5 different Arab country capitals with John Connally, the former governor of Texas, who was in that car behind John F. Kennedy the day of the assassination. And this man named Ben Barnes didn't know what he was going to be doing in this, but he suddenly realized, oh my gosh, Connally's out here telling these different Arab leaders, would you please pass a message to the Iranians? Don't make a deal on those hostages. You're going to get a much better deal when Reagan's elected. Well, in my view, that's kind of political dynamite. And then, of course, I remembered, well, of course, Gary wrote about this a long, long time ago, and I did a little research, and it's been
32, I think. 1991. Yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty remarkable. So he sort of laid out this whole concept. And what I didn't fully appreciate, Gary, until I looked it up. So both the Senate and the House sides did a little report. It took over a year. Some of them were quite lengthy to get to the bottom of this. And not surprisingly, they came out with, well, there's nothing firm here that can really corroborate this story. So I'm always intrigued by things like this. So when I read this New York Times article, I thought, I wonder if this will serve the purpose of reviving the whole controversy yet again. So that's basically why Gary is here today. So before we go into his talk, just a few other things about Gary that you may or may not know. He's got a PhD from Columbia University. We won't mention dates. He went to University of Kansas, and I have to ask, were you there when Will Chamberlain was there?
I was.
I'm so jealous. Oh,
I actually went to that famous basketball game in which North Carolina beat us by 1 point in triple overtime. But sad day for KU. But it was yes, I was there.
Oh, now
So you might as well mention dates. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to be 88. Okay, so that's.
I wasn't going to mention your birthday.
That's all right. It's not much of a secret.
Anyway, so Gary holds a bachelor's from University of Kansas and master in science from George Washington University. He also served in the Navy, earned the rank of captain, not shabby, and then found his way into the U.S. government and was at the National Security Council during the Ford and Carter and early Reagan years, as one of the Middle East wonks working at the NSC. So with that, I'll turn over to you, Gary.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate it. And I am especially pleased to be here for the Jervis seminar because I was a great friend of Bob Jervis. He worked on this issue, but he worked on a lot of issues surrounding this issue. And I had many, many conversations with him on that subject, and I'm glad Kathy is here. And I especially wore my T-shirt today in Bob's honor. So he wouldn't have worn the coat. He would have just had on the shirt, but that's okay. I've got a lot to talk about. I mean, way more than I can cover. So let me do it in kind of telegraph style, lay out some of the issues, some of the points, and then you're going to have time to ask questions, and I'm open to whatever you want to talk about. In the last year or two, there have been several new histories of the Carter administration period. Stuart Eisenstadt wrote a very thick and very authoritative book on Jimmy Carter, The White House Years. Jonathan Alter then came out with his book, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. And then Kai Bird wrote another book called The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. And all three of these books have really begun to challenge people to rethink the Carter administration. It was easy to sort of denounce the Carter presidency as nothing burger, nothing really happened. Carter wasn't a very good president. He was a wonderful host president, but he wasn't really much in office. They all challenged that in rather considerable detail, and I recommend that you take a look at those if you're really interested. One of the things that happened, in which I was very much associated during that period, was the Iranian Revolution. And I'm certainly not going to try to go into detail about it here, but the bottom line is that the Iranian people rose up under the leadership of Khomeini and overthrew the Shah. The Shah was forced to leave his place and leave the country in January of 1979. And at that point, it actually cut the legs right out from under the U.S. strategy and policy in the Persian Gulf. I mean, that was we had relied on the Shah to protect American interests in the region, and when he left, we were left with nothing really. One of the points that I want to make, which you don't often hear, is that presidents don't have the luxury of doing one thing at a time. And I know this for me, this has a very particular meaning, because on September 9th of 1978, I'm getting all my decades mixed up. Carter was at Camp David with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, and he had actually bet his presidency that he would be able to get these two guys together to basically make Middle East peace. That's a different story. But on September 9th, he was at Camp David, and that is also the date that the Jalal Square incident took place in Tehran, in which, for the first time, people were demonstrating in the streets, and the military intervened and began shooting people in the street. And it was a dramatic day. And apparently, Anwar Sadat suggested to Carter that he call the Shah after the worst of it was over. I was covering the White House on the Washington end, while everybody else that worked on the Middle East was up at Camp David. I didn't work on Middle East peace. My friend Bill Quant was actually in charge of the Arab-Israel peace process, so he got that, and I got the Iranian Revolution. So that's life isn't fair. But in any case, on that date, I was in Washington, and a call was placed through to the Shah in Iran, and Jimmy Carter in Camp David was talking to the Shah in Iran, and I was an interloper. I was listening in on the phone call from Washington. So So I know that the phone call took place. The Shah had no memory of this later on. Carter, I think, forgot about it completely. But it was rather an interesting moment because one, the Shah he sounded stunned. He talked like somebody who had been drugged. It was really clear that he didn't know what to think. Hair on was burning at the time. Carter sounded like somebody who had other things on his mind. And he clearly was thinking about Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat and the peace process. And he had them waiting right outside the door after he finished this conversation. So these two leaders had a sort of conversation back and forth. Nothing of any significance was actually said, but Carter said, "We're sorry to hear about your troubles and all, and hang in there and so forth." And but it was an interesting thing. But the reality was that Carter had other things on his mind than Iran, and this was not what he was thinking about full time. Actually, as a social engineer, Carter's heart was really on the Arab-Israel peacemaking process. That's what he really, really deeply cared about. And it was not on the Iranian Revolution, where in fact there were no good options at all, and where the US was involved as an outsider, but had very little influence on what actually was going on. Moreover, throughout the whole process, Carter was told by Ambassador Sullivan and others in Tehran and elsewhere that the Shah was a big boy. He could take care of this by himself. These were just demonstrations that were going on and they were building up. And basically, there wasn't much the US could do. And the Shah was quite capable. He had a huge army. He had a secret service. He had scads of money, and he could take care of this problem by himself. And of course, Carter, I think, was glad to hear that because he had other things that he was thinking about, and he didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. It was a true intelligence failure, as far as and we share that. You didn't mention I was in naval intelligence, so I share the blame with you as well. We thought we knew the Shah, but we really didn't. And the Shah, I'll tell you a quick little anecdote. The Shah came in 1978, I guess 77, to visit the White House, and that's a famous case where the people they fired tear gas at demonstrators and wafted over. I was in the place at the time that happened, and they were up on a podium. It was my first experience with tear gas. I had never been tear gassed before, and neither had the Shah, I'm pretty sure, and others that were on the way. And so people were wiping their eyes, and but later looked very prophetic about what was going to happen later on. But that night there was a state dinner for the Shah, and after the dinner, the Carter had asked a magnificent jazz trio to play for the Shah in the East Room after dinner. And one of the thrills of my life actually is I was seated right beside Father Hines, a great piano player, and we talked jazz a little bit in the course of the dinner. But he and Sarah Vaughan and Dizzy Gillespie played for the party after the dinner was over. And they don't usually, these things at the White House are very short. They play 2 or 3 numbers and then everybody claps and that's it. And so everybody clapped, and Carter immediately stood up and walked up to the stage and was shaking hands with all the players. And we were all giving a standing ovation for the players, and the Shah stood up and he stood there sort of rigid. And finally his wife just shoved him from behind, and he went up to the front and shook hands very stiffly with all of the players. And it said something about the man, that he was carefully scripted. In a meeting, in a formal occasion, he was remarkable. He was under control. He had everything himself under control. When it wasn't scripted, and when he was called upon to sort of do something on his own, improvise, he really didn't know what to do. And at least that's what I took from this little incident. In any event, we saw the Shah the image that he wanted everybody to see. And it was the other Shah, the uncertain, unable to improvise Shah, who was actually running things in Tehran at the time. What the Shah probably needed to do was what he was told twice by his military and his own Savak people, that basically he should round up the leaders of these demonstrations, take them off to an island someplace and hold them to, remove the head of the beast, and then flood the streets with military people and all, so that the people who were coming out to demonstrate would change their mind and go home. And you could do this with, it didn't mean going out and shooting everybody in the country to make this happen. He was presented twice with plans to do exactly that by his own people. And he turned them down both times flat. He refused to do it. And his argument that he used in writing later on and other times was, he said a king doesn't shoot his own people. Well, a king does shoot his own people, and it certainly has been known to happen. But the Shah had this sort of mystical relationship, or at least he felt that he did, with his people. In any event, however you cut it, the U.S. suffered an enormous strategic loss because of the loss of Iran. And that really has shaped the contemporary Middle East ever since that time. I'm not going to go into it more. You can ask about the revolution if you want later on in the continent. But I want to switch quickly to the hostage crisis just to remind you of sort of what happened, since most of you weren't there at the time. And it does actually, there are things that are worth remembering. Jimmy Carter decided to admit the Shah to New York Hospital for treatment. He was living in Cuernavaca in exile, and that was a big mistake. He was brought there because the political pressure. This was an election year, and the political pressure was building up enormously, and he had a whole David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, McCloy, and a number of other high mucky mucks were pushing Carter very, very hard to let the Shah into the country. And when we discovered, or they discovered, the Rockefeller people, that the Shah had cancer and was being jaundiced and actually in bad shape. They then insisted that he be allowed to come here on a humanitarian basis for treatment. They had been pushing for him to come in anyway. And Carter, against his better judgment, made the decision, it was a wrong decision, to let the Shah in on October 22nd of 1979. And the embassy was taken by a group of students, well organized, on November 4th. Early November was a bad time when you're talking about the Iranian Revolution. Everything worked. All the worst things happened in November. As it turned out, Ezer Weitzman from Israel was in the country at the time, and he sat down with our Secretary of Defense, and they looked at it and looked over the situation the day that the place was taken, the hostages were taken. And Weitzman, who had been involved in the Entebbe operation, looked at this. He said, "This is no Entebbe." Basically, you had all of these people in the center of a major city, surrounded by a revolutionary, craziness that was going on throughout the entire country at the time, with mobs running around and unpredictable things, and really nobody fully in control. And getting in there and trying to get them out was really going to be in Entebbe. They nicely took all the hostages out to an airport outside town, and you could fly in, get them, and fly out. And you couldn't do it here. This was a very different operation entirely. The students themselves didn't really know what they were up to. They thought that they were doing a sit-in. A lot of these people had been in American colleges, and they knew what a sit-in was, and they knew what demonstrations were. And but then the government, they thought what would happen is they'd go in, take over the embassy, and the government would say to them, "Okay, boys, now you've made your point, go home, and we'll take it from here." What happened instead was the Khomeini and the government joined the students and basically said, "Right on, we're with you." And suddenly, these kids, who they were all mostly grad students, who were holding the hostages in the embassy, they went from being sit-ins to being running a prison. And they were in charge of running that prison for 444 days from that point on. They had to completely, and they make it very clear in their own memoirs, that they had not expected this at all, that wasn't what they had in mind. They weren't prepared for it, but they did.
I can interject 1 second. The 444 days, I remember, this is shortly after I left graduate school, but my wife and I used to watch Ted Koppel.
Nightline, that was all.
Nightline on every night at like 11 o'clock.
And it started right then.
And it was like, today is day 371, today is day 394. And the political impact of this never ending torrent of our poor hostages.
Yeah.
They've been in there over a year. It had a huge political impact.
Actually, on the morning that the hostages were taken, like everybody else involved, I got a call about 4 o'clock in the morning. Big time difference between U.S. and Iran. And we all sort of threw on whatever we could and came in. And we all came to the State Department on the 7th floor, I guess it is. In any case, it was up not very far from the secretary's office. There's a big conference room, bigger than this, but sort of like this, with a long table in the middle. And on the table were telephone repeaters. And they had called the embassy, every office in the embassy that they had a telephone number for, and they were on these lines as we all grouped in there. And while we were listening, one line after another was going dead, which was not a good sign. Ted Koppel and his team came in and did a quick circuit of the whole room. I don't know how he got in there, but he did. He got special permission. He came in. They didn't show anything detailed or really stay there and listen to what was going on. But then he went out, and then he was in a new career from that point on. I will spare you a lot of the details. In particular, let's just cut to the chase. In September of 1980, the Germans got in touch with the U.S. government and said, "We have a representative of the Ayatollah Khomeini who is here in Bonn, and he is willing to negotiate the release of the hostages." And that was the first contact, direct official contact between the government, so-called government of Iran, because it kept changing all the time, and the U.S. government. We had been trying for now almost a year to do this, and it hadn't. So actually, the fellow who was waiting in Bonn was Sadek Tabatabai. His sister was married to Khomeini's son, so he had a family relationship, and he had been a deputy foreign minister. He was the real thing. 4 days later, Khomeini, in a speech that had nothing to do with this, just broke into a little piece of it, and just out of nowhere said, "Here are the 4 conditions that we have for the release of the hostages." He was talking to pilgrims. He was talking to other things. He just stopped everything and stopped for about 2 minutes and read out the 4 conditions. He wanted to unfreeze all the Iranian assets, cancel all claims against Iran, assured non-intervention in Iranian domestic affairs ever again, and return all of the Shah's assets. Those were the 4 things that he was looking for. It's one of the things I've learned just recently, and I'll get to that. The Reagan campaign, which this was the election was coming up. This was September, and the election was coming up in November. So this was tense time. Um, the Reagan campaign inquired with their sources in the Carter campaign and said, the Carter White House, and said, can the White House accept this? I mean, is Carter willing to do this? And the answer was no, absolutely not. I mean, it might be a starting point for negotiations, but this was not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. And the very next day, on the 13th, after Khomeini made his announcement, the Reagan campaign made a public statement. In fact, Reagan himself, when he was on his way to an Italian dinner or something like this, that he was being honored or something, he took the reporters aside and he said, referring to Khomeini's bargains, his demands, he said, Reagan said, and I'm quoting, "We can and should agree to unfreezing all the Iranian assets and the cancellation of any and all claims against Iran, and also everything and non-intervention in Iranian affairs. We should just accept that. And the only thing that we can't do is return the Shah's assets, which, quote, cannot be confiscated without due process of law." Now, everybody's forgotten about this. This was a very minor thing, but it does tell you where the way the Reagan campaign was. People have talked later on about Reagan was going to be fierce and tough. And so the Iranians would be scared of him, and that's why they would give up the hostages. This is what he was offering in September. And he did it publicly. It's in the New York Times. You can read it. And nobody has ever denied that this happened. It was kind of a little side thing that I thought was interesting. On September 22nd, we sent, by the way, then Warren Christopher took a team, went to Bonn, started negotiating with the Iranians there. And on September 22nd, Saddam invaded Iran. And so Tabatabai, who was in Germany at the time, and it was planning to actually fly back on the 22nd to Tehran to report on the negotiations, couldn't even fly back because it was a war zone, and all of a sudden, all flights were canceled in that area. Basically, pretty much everything stopped at that point. There were still some negotiations that went on, but they really came to a halt there after Saddam invaded. The weekend before the November 4th, everything happens in November, right? November 4th election, the Majlis in Iran met and approved a series of demands that we got on that day. Carter flew back to the White House and he was handed the statement that was made by the Iranian Majlis, making a whole series of requests that were impossible for us to accept. And so instead of having where he could go on public TV the day before the election and say, we haven't got a full-scale agreement yet, but we've got something we can really work with here. This looks really good. And he could inject a little bit of good news into the election. Instead, he went on and said, this is something we can talk about with them, but it's not what we're looking for. And it was gloom everywhere. And so every American on that day, 2 days before the election, heard from the president and all their newspapers that there was no real chance of getting the hostages out right away. And as you all know, I assume, Carter lost in a landslide. A few days after the election, two Algerian officials showed up at the State Department and introduced themselves and said that they had been nominated by the government in Iran to act as intermediaries to negotiate the release of the hostages. And after thinking about this for a bit, we accepted their offer. And that began a new set of negotiations that went on until basically the inauguration day. These negotiations, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, had their ups and downs, but in the end of December, when we were getting very close to the inauguration, the Iranians came in with an absolutely unexpected demand for $24 billion in ransom, which we didn't, I mean, we didn't even consider it. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And so we thought, well, it's all over. We'll just let the Reagan people, they can have this problem to deal with when they arrive. Because Carter had been working hard on this to try to get through it. And then about 2 weeks later, week and a half later, we went back and told them we'd be willing to keep talking. And we just didn't even mention the money at all. And they never mentioned it again either. I think they knew that it was a loser. But in any event, about 2 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, they came to us, I think it's January 12th, and said that they had completely changed their position. They were now prepared to pay off all of the loans to the banks. They were prepared to do everything that was necessary and basically just get rid of the hostages. And this was very detrimental to Iran. And it was so detrimental that, in fact, Warren Christopher told me at the time that we would never have dreamed of even asking them to do this. It was so crazy. But he said it was a great thing. And so then the hard work really began. Between the 12th and the 21st of January, the whole thing was negotiated again and in detail. One of the things that I think almost nobody understands about the way this turned out, and we had the Algiers Accords were later on signed, but what happened because of Iran changing its position, the Iranians had originally had $12 billion in U.S. banks and in U.S. And a lot of it in gold. And we were supposed to pay that back to them as we released the hostages. What happened was that to pay off all of their loans cost them almost $4 billion, $3.7 billion. They put another $1.4 billion in escrow to deal with claims that were to be dealt with at the Hague because a new arbitration court was set up. And $2.8 billion was returned to Iran out of their 12 that they started with. And there was lots of other money elsewhere, but this was the key stuff. That's what we were really negotiating about. I did a back of the envelope, calculation. That money that they did not get back at the end of the day amounted to more than $300,000 per day per hostage. And there aren't many governments around that would pay that out. And not only that, completely ruin their reputation and destroy their relationship with what had been their major arms supplier and so forth. But they did. And so, in effect, at the end, they paid us to get the hostages back. Okay, now enough of that. So, October surprise. Peter's already mentioned the story by Peter Baker in the New York Times. I wrote this book 32 years ago, 1991, published October Surprise. And so my name has become sort of officially associated with that ever since that time. What I did for that book was I spent about 1.5 years, collecting all of the evidence that I could get my hands on. I had not believed that there was any hanky-panky in the election. Yes, they released the hostages 30 minutes after Reagan became president. That looks a little suspicious, and a lot of people thought that there was something funny going on. On the other hand, the Iranians were quite capable of doing that just to rub Carter's nose in it. So I didn't think that too much of it. But after a while, I started hearing stories from a lot of different people about evidence that there had really been interference with the election. So I discovered that most of the people in the Middle East already believed that this happened. I mean, they really believed that there was an October surprise, and they couldn't figure out why other people didn't. Carter himself, I think, in time came to be a believer, many other people, but there was no smoking gun. there was no picture of Casey sitting with the Iranians in Madrid. And there was no copy of the document that they signed about, you give me this and I'll give you that. We had none of that. So it was all circumstantial evidence. And most of the sources that we had to rely on were arms dealers and folks that you wouldn't invite to a garden party. I had a whole new education actually in dealing with these people. And I did for a year and a half, went all over the world talking to people like this. Sometimes they were all, professional liars, and that's the way they make their living. And so you have to understand that when you start. So basically, having a story from one of them is simply not enough. You had to get 2 or 3 or 4 sources, and if the sources actually resembled each other, I mean, their story resembled each other, maybe you had something, but you couldn't trust any one of them. Okay, in the past, so I finished that, and there were House and Senate looked at it, as Peter said, and came to the conclusion that it couldn't be proved, and that there was there wasn't a smoking gun. And at that point, I was teaching at Columbia. I was doing a lot of other things. I turned my head away from the October surprise and worked on other things. So for about, after I published the book, there was a flurry of activity. There was all of the investigations, and then it was over. Basically, you could either believe it or not believe it. And I continued to believe it. On the other hand, I'd done what I could do. Still, because my name was associated, people would call me up when they had little bits and pieces of information, and that kept dribbling in from 1991 up until really today. We learned about Casey's trip to Madrid. They had insisted, and the investigations had found that Casey couldn't possibly be in Madrid. Then a cable showed up that said Casey was in Madrid, and they didn't know what he was up to. Okay. Arafat met with Jimmy Carter and told him to his face that he had been contacted by representatives of the Republican campaign, the Casey campaign, and had asked them to delay the hostage release until after the election. And Arafat said he didn't do it, but he had gotten the message. I don't know whether he did it or not. There were covert arms deliveries from Israel to Iran that set up a pattern of arms, and the request that Arafat got, he said that this was from the Republicans saying, we'll pay you off in arms, if you do what we suggest, keep the hostages there. And there was also a deathbed apology, literally, by a guy who was a famous oil trader, an arms trader, and a friend of mine was contacted, was a friend of the family, and was there. He was not doing well and was clearly on his last legs. And he said to my friend, he said, oh, by the way, he said, we really owe you an apology. And he said, apology for what? He said, oh, that October surprise thing, that keeping the hostages there for longer than was necessary. And unfortunately, my friend didn't know much about the issue, wasn't ready to ask any follow-on questions, and the guy died. So this is the kind of thing that I've been dealing with over years, bits and pieces dribbling in. So the Barnes story in the New York Times was indeed really significant. It turns out that wasn't the first time this story had been told. The guy, a historian who wrote a history of Connolly, former Governor Connolly, had one half paragraph about this trip that he had made to the Middle East in his book. Nobody noticed it, including me, of course. But it made me, what the Barnes story did was, Barnes had no rational justification for talking about this. He had sat on this for 33 years or over 40 years. He had sat on this story and told nobody, told 2 or 3 people that he trusted personally. But now he was saying, here's what we did. And there's evidence that he actually was with Connolly, and they did go to 6 capitals, I believe, but it may be only 5.
Israel was.
Israel, that's right. Okay, Israel's the 6th. He probably didn't deliver. Maybe he did. Who knows?
Good question.
In any case, Barnes' story that Connolly went into each of these meetings and said, don't let if you can get a message to the Iranians not to release the hostages because they'll get a better deal. We're going to win this election, and you'll get a better deal with the Republicans if you just wait. So I wonder, are there any more deathbed confessions, any more guilty parties who are going to decide that now? I mean, Barnes is, as you say, in hospice care and 98 years old. He probably has nothing really to lose at this point except a little bit of reputation and people being a little angry that he waited this long to actually let us know. But what we have now is a pretty convincing circumstantial case, but we're still waiting for other shoes to drop. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the Republicans contacted the Iranians and asked them to hold the hostages. That, I think, is a given. That we know, I think, for a fact. But all the details about what happened after that are still pretty murky. You can talk about it. I wanted to give you a little information that hasn't been in the papers and which which I find very meaningful. One is the Portuguese connection. Portugal, nobody was thinking about Portugal during this whole affair. But it turns out later on that through Portugal, the Israelis delivered an aircraft load of arms to Iran during 1980 through Portugal without telling the Carter administration. So this is while the hostages are still there. And your motives, you can argue why they might. But more significant from my point of view is that after the election, which was November 4th, just the next month, there was another delivery of arms, fairly significant, from Israel to Iran. And then the day after the hostages were released, there was still another delivery that went to Iran. And these deliveries continued on under the Reagan administration. One aircraft crashed at one point and made the news, so it was a small story which most people didn't notice. But Secretary of State Haig, under the Reagan administration, actually approved Israeli shipments of spare parts and F4 tires to Iran. Now, if you wanted to pay off somebody, that's not a bad way to do it, and you don't even have to wait until your administration gets into office to do it. Later, arms were shipped through Sweden, I've discovered, and I've become a friend of an investigative reporter who's working there on a different subject, but our interests overlap. And it turns out that the shipments were going on starting at least in 1982. So we've got 80, 81, 82, and then the shipments through Sweden begin to pick up after that point, and they start providing some of the arms actually that go to Iran. You've got to realize Iran was fighting a war against Iraq during this whole time, so they're interested in getting military equipment. Some of the planes that were used on some of these deliveries are the same ones that were used in the Iran-Contra affair by Oliver North and company when they were secretly providing arms to Iran to release some American hostages in Lebanon, and also curry favor to basically they were looking to open up a relationship with the moderates in Iran. So that was in 1985 and 86. And so from my point of view, there was a straight line from a delivery system was set up and operating that started sometime in 1980 and then periodically thereafter. In fact, one that is so well established that by the time you get to Iran-Contra, none of us knew that at the time because this was all sub rosa. It wasn't U.S. government stuff at all. The Anyway, by the time we got to, we thought all of this was new, that it had just been invented by the Reagan administration to send arms to Iran because they wanted to release these hostages and because they wanted to open up a relationship with Iran. Turned out it had been going on for quite a long time before that started. Okay, that's not the only straight line. The other straight line is actually what we were talking about at the beginning, and that is that this wasn't really the first time that this had happened. That's in 1968, when Richard Nixon was running for office against originally LBJ, but then he dropped out, and Hubert Humphrey ran for president. Claire Chennault, who was a representative of Nixon but was tied up with the South Vietnamese, delivered a message from the Nixon campaign: do not join the Vietnam peace talks with LBJ, that Nixon will give you a better deal and he's going to win this election. And they did. They dropped out of the peace talks. The war went on, and a lot of people died because of that. And Nixon won narrowly. In 1972, John Connally, remember John Connally? He made a trip to Saudi Arabia and to Iran on behalf of Richard Nixon in his 1972 campaign. The first one was to Saudi Arabia to ask them not to nationalize the American oil company, Aramco, which they were planning to do, until after the election. Wait until after the election, then you can do it if you want to. And they did. And as a matter of fact, the big oil companies took a beating because of this. They got a much worse deal than they would have before. And then he also went on to Iran a little bit later on and basically told the ambassador there. The ambassador said if he wanted to go see the Shah, and he said he was going to ask him something really inappropriate, and so he didn't want the ambassador to go with him. And the ambassador said, no, I'm going to go with you. So he went and saw the Shah, and they talked about strategy and stuff for a little bit. And basically the ambassador, after it was over, said, what was all of that about? There was nothing said of any interest at all. And Connally said, well, I couldn't deliver my message to the Shah, but I can tell you that I was going to ask the Shah to donate secretly to Nixon's reelection campaign, which is absolutely against the law. No doubt about it. And this, we remember, it was Watergate was going on around this. That's when the Watergate break-in took in place. So actually, but Nixon won in a landslide in that election. None of this stuff was really necessary. In 1980, we've just talked about it. So Reagan and Casey asked the Iranians to hold the hostages till after the election. So would the Republicans have won all three of these elections if you had not had these potentially reasonless actions? We will really never know. But the lesson to me seems to be that you can do these things and get away with it. Even if history identifies the wrongdoing, it really is too late to do anything about it 50 years later. And that's sort of where we're at. So with that, I'll quit and I'll take your questions, whatever you're interested in, we can discuss. So.
Wow, Gary, thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening. Can I say a little depressing, but
pretty depressing.
But it does provide a little context. I mean, we're spending an awful lot of time, even in the recent past, about monkey business and elections. And unfortunately, it's a little more domestic than it is foreign, although 2016 and the Russians, the whole separate case. I wanted to showcase one thing more that I didn't say earlier. So Gary wrote this first book in 1985 called All Fall Down, America's Tragic Encounter with Iran. And the copy I have was a copy that Gary gave to Professor Bob Jervis with a nice little statement. And I just discovered this morning, there's a page with all of Bob's comments about the book. So I'm going to return the book. Since it is really your book.
And if I can read Bob's handwriting,
It's not easy.
Kathy, if I
We
run
didn't want to.
yeah. So Kathy, if I run into trouble, I'll call for help. Okay.
So,
Looking for some kind of software that can make it legible. That's not,
Good
not.
maybe we can employ AI. AI can fix.
So is anybody going to be, there's a lot of people online.
There are,
Is
so I think.
is anybody watching?
Maureen's left, maybe she's looking into how we could do that remotely, but for the time being, if there are questions here, happy to start, sir.
I'd like to know, you probably saw the film Argo.
I saw Argo, yes.
Is it a true story? It's very adherent to the what happened.
It is Argo was a true story with Hollywood additions.
Yeah.
So Hollywood juiced up the story a lot. It wouldn't have been quite as exciting if it had been the truth. The reality is on that one climactic scene where they're at the airport and they're waiting and to see if the Iranians are going to discover that they're being smuggled out of the country, and then you have people running down the runway after the airplane after it's already started to take off. Not true. They went to the airport, they checked out, they got on the airplane, they flew away, and the Iranians discovered it much later. And but it wouldn't have been as exciting.
Yeah, two questions. With taking this experience, do you think there is some something that you can take advantage of the future relations that the US is going to take with Iran today?
You know, I've worked on US-Iran relations for, call it 50 years. And, you know, there have been ups and there have been downs. The US has really tried to open up the system at various points. I didn't mention Bush really in the next election because it wasn't really illegal. He basically was negotiating with the Iranians behind the scenes to get them to release another group of American hostages in Lebanon, or at least one, and then in his State of the Union address, he said that goodwill begets goodwill, and he was talking directly to the Iranians. So you do me a favor, and I'll do you one, and that is legal. I mean, there's nothing illegal about that, but it was fiddling around the edges. Anyway, if there were a neat way in which the United States and Iran could come together in some way and deal with their problems, their issues, that would be wonderful. But at the moment, it's about as low a percentage opportunity as you could get. I mean, we've quit negotiating over the JCPOA. The Iranians are not doing anything on that. And the Iranians are now turning and moving away and aligning themselves with the Chinese and the Russians and leaving the West behind.
And
So
Israel subject also with a factor. Israel is not collaborating with.
no. I mean, Israel has been running a sabotage campaign in Iran, which doesn't simplify things at all. But the short answer to your question is no. The long answer is too long, basically.
And
I just want to add that the movie Argo was based on an article about the rescue that was written by one of my former SEPA students that I had 25 years ago in a writing class, Josh Behrman.
Very good. No, basically, a CIA guy did go into Iran with a disguise and did in fact meet with the hostages that were being held at the Canadian embassy, and he went several times actually and briefed them and taught them what to do, how to get out. They were pretending to be a film crew, and they had false IDs and passports and stuff, and the Canadians happily provided Canadian passports for the the Americans who were there. I guess they had to turn their passports in after they got back. And so all of those parts of the story were in fact true, and they were in fact taken out, exfiltrated, they call it, from Iran. And then the story broke after they got out. And but it was a true story, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering why Israel would have been involved in the operation, because they seem to be the key international actor, helping the Republicans if the conspiracy theory all played out the way it's been portrayed. They did just, have the Camp David Accords.
They did.
Why did they dislike Jimmy Carter so much that they would conspire with his political opposition to?
Remember, the Israelis had their own reasons for wanting to send arms to Iran. This was after the revolution, and it really is a long story to really go into.
But why help the Republicans? What was their?
Well, they were, for one thing, they were helping Iran defend itself against Iraq, so that Iraq would, in fact, they wanted Iran to be able to defend itself, and they wanted them to keep the Iraqis distracted. And so feeding them arms up to a point was the way.
But that runs against the conspiracy theory. In other words, that means
No,
Israel
but it doesn't. But think about Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
That was an Israeli deal where they actually went to the Republican administration in Washington and convinced them to go with them, to join them in sending arms.
Right. But in this case, it was a campaign going to the Israelis. So if the campaign goes to the Israelis, if the Israelis are trying to respond to the campaign and not just to give the Iranians weapons so they don't lose to the Iraqis, which is, a major concern of Israel, of course, that Saddam might win, then that would run against the conspiracy. And if they sold the arms to Iran in order to help Ronald Reagan, that would be consistent with the conspiracy. But I'm just trying to wrap my head around why the Israelis would have such animus towards the Carter administration that they would want to help.
Well, they really didn't like the Carter administration, and
That's what I was trying to explain.
And as somebody who was pulling for the Carter administration and who was quite pleased at getting the Algiers, the Camp David Accords signed and sealed, but then, in fact, it was never fully put into operation, and so in the end, it didn't look as great as it did at the time. But basically, Menachem Begin almost walked out of the Camp David meetings, was sort of held by force, and then basically they settled for much less than what they anticipated in the Camp David Accords, and Reagan, and then Begin went away, and I think Carter and a company would say that they welched on the deal. So maybe somebody else can explain what their the concern was. But anyway, I wish there was a nice, neat answer to your question. But about this subject, nothing is nice and neat. And I must stress that what I've told you is all, again, we have a new piece of evidence, and that is we're absolutely, I think, have reason to be absolutely confident that in fact the Republicans did ask the Iranians to hold the hostages. We do know that. The rest of it is surmise, and so what I'm giving you are the bits and pieces of stuff that we've learned that suggest that something like this happened. But I wish I could explain every detail. I'm hoping before I die that the story will, the full
Thank
story
you for your presentation.
will
Nice
come
to
out.
see you.
Sure. So, I have a question that's kind of about history, historians, and history education, all kind of wrapped up into one. I was a high school teacher for the better part of 10 years. And like you just said in your last answer, there's obviously more to the story than you can explain. And I think as a former high school teacher, you don't have time and real estate to explain why the Carter presidency ended the way that it did. but also, a lot in history tends to be overlooked by other events. So for example, when I taught about Nixon, I didn't teach about the sort of secret negotiations with the Vietnamese, or you're not going to have time to be able to teach about prospectively the Reagan administration in negotiation with the Iranians. Or in secret, sorry, the Reagan campaign in secret negotiation with the Iranians. So I think my question isn't so much about Carter as it is about an inability of historians, history educators to really include what you just said a few minutes ago was potentially treasonous behavior that just will not get part of that legacy.
Well, actually, Josh, I quit teaching a couple of years ago here at Columbia, and when I was teaching my class on U.S. foreign policy in the Persian Gulf, I didn't teach the October surprise because it was, there wasn't. You couldn't say this happened, that happened. You couldn't say here's what the Republicans, in fact. That was before we had the Barnes statement. I would have at least probably mentioned that in my class. But I wrote the book, and my students knew that I'd written this book, and many of them asked me questions about it. But I didn't teach it because there was too many pieces missing, and that that's you try not to teach, surmise when you're teaching a class. So, and I can certainly understand why high school teachers would not do it.
I've got two more hands here, but first I want to go online. Olivia, you've got.
Yeah, we can go back and forth. There are.
Why don't you go first?
Okay, great. So this is from an anonymous attendee who thanks you for your lecture and says, as an Iranian, I'm surprised by the continued US negotiations with the current regime, which ultimately is leading to more killings and jailing of civilians. With the ongoing women-led protests going on in Iran now, how do you anticipate, if any, reverse actions from the US?
Obviously I'm not in the administration, and in fact, he says negotiations go on. There's no negotiations that I'm aware of. I mean, there's negotiations over the JCPOA, the arms deal, the nuclear deal quit, and yes, it could be revived. And so it's conceivable that we could get back into negotiations. There have been some negotiations on the side about getting people out who are basically being held hostage in Iran today. And there are some side negotiations. I would really want there to be side negotiations. If I were sitting in an Iranian jail, I would like very much for somebody to be trying to get me out, regardless of what was going on in the streets of Tehran. But otherwise, I'm not aware that we're negotiating with them about anything at present. And so what I think, to the best of my knowledge, what we're doing now makes perfectly good sense. And, if we get back to negotiating about the JCPOA again, that is something that I would definitely be in favor of. Get the nuclear deal to actually, when Trump walked away from the deal in 2018, the Iranians waited for a year to see if we really meant it. And then they started increasing their nuclear activity. And they're clearly doing that as a negotiating factor. They now have done away with all the good that was done by getting the JCPOA in the first place. The Iranians have enough, enriched uranium to make a bomb in a matter of weeks, if it really comes to that. And they probably can't put it on a missile and fire it, but they're pretty smart and they know how to do that. And basically, we've pushed them to that. I mean, before, their enriched uranium was 3 kilograms, something like that. That's all they were permitted to have. They've now, they've got, they've got enough to make at least one and probably several bombs by just uh, running it through the centrifuges a few more times. So I don't think we've gained anything by not negotiating with them. In fact, we've lost a lot, and I regret that very badly. But we're not. But now, I think the Biden administration didn't handle it very well, and I think that we're stuck now with the worst of all possible outcomes. You know, we didn't. Our pressure tactics didn't work. Our walking away from the deal didn't work. Our negotiations didn't work, and now we've got an Iran that is just an inch away from having a nuclear weapon, and that's not what I don't know if that's what President Trump was aiming at when he walked away, but I don't think that was what he had in mind. But that's where we're at.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have lots of questions. First is how and why President Carter was convinced to let Shah in. There is a conspiracy theory that Kissinger and Rockefeller were a stakeholder in anything happened bad in Iran. And was it related to negotiation with the Soviet Union or not? And number two, did anyone back then in the White House know the Shah had cancer? And was it?
Okay, well, these are two very big questions that are very
Can I ask number three?
no, but they're very popular. Okay, so okay, sure.
Could you please explain a bit more about the General Heiser's trip to Iran to convince the military army?
Okay, so that's the whole Iranian Revolution in one. Okay, I'll try to do this. I mean, basically, I could spend a day, answering those questions. But basically, I think it's not as complicated as it may appear. One, it's not a conspiracy theory that Rockefeller and Kissinger and company tried to persuade the Carter administration to admit the Shah. They did, and we have, there's really good evidence. Actually, David Kirkpatrick in the New York Times about a year and a half ago, I think it was, wrote a story about this. He had gotten into the Rockefeller papers and recorded what was actually written there. And there are, written documents and notes from meetings that they had saying that they were doing everything they possibly could to get the Shah into the United States. Okay. The story of the Shah, when he left the country, he had an open invitation to come to the United States, and the Annenberg estate in California was set and ready for him to go. And it had security and all of that. Instead, he flew to Aswan, Egypt, and stayed with his friend Anwar Sadat for a long time until Sadat began having troubles because the Shah was there and he was getting demonstrations and the like. So the Shah realized he'd outstayed his welcome, and then he went to Morocco and stayed with his friend, the king. And he stayed there until he ran out of his welcome. In the meantime, they had taken all the hostages in Iran, and we were in a completely different place. So then he was about ready to decide to go to the States, but we didn't want him at that point. I mean, a lot of water had gone under the bridge at that stage. So in fact, he ended up, the Rockefellers found him a place in the Bahamas. He didn't like that, and that went through very quickly. And then they found him a place in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And they weren't really the State Department was out of it at this point. The Rockefellers had completely taken over, and they were running the show. But they wanted to get him into the United States. So, long story short, the Shah got very ill and was jaundiced and not in good shape at all. And David Rockefeller sent his good friend, Benjamin Keene, doctor at New York Hospital, to Mexico. He looked at him. He said they thought maybe he had malaria. He was a tropical disease doctor. And he knew immediately that it wasn't malaria, but the Shah didn't tell him what it was. And he came back to New York again and said, he's very ill, but I don't know what the problem is. Then one of his French doctors, who had been taking care of him ever since 1974, when he was diagnosed with lymphoma, came to Mexico to treat him. They had been feeding him chemo to keep the symptoms down. didn't cure the disease, but would keep the symptoms down. What the Shah actually needed was a splenectomy, to have the spleen removed. That was just standard process. And but he wouldn't do that, because if he went into a hospital and had his spleen removed, it wouldn't be a secret anymore. And everybody would know that he had cancer, at which point everybody would change their policies toward Iran. They would say, okay, now what do we do after the Shah? And he was really afraid of that. It was a very well kept secret. We didn't know. I can tell you the CIA didn't know. My good friend Bob did the after action report in the CIA and had full clearance and looked everywhere he could look, talked to everybody he could talk to, and said that he could find no evidence that the CIA knew that he had. Ambassador Helms, who had been the ambassador to Iran, who had been the former head of CIA, was interviewed by a reporter after all of these events took place, and he said that he didn't know, and that he had interviewed de Marange in Paris and some of the other high-level intelligence people in Paris itself, and they insisted that they didn't know. I don't believe that, frankly, but but I think de Marange actually did know, and that he was working hand in glove with some people. And it may be that the Republican campaign actually knew more. But I know that Helms went to Iran on his own on a secret trip in the summer of 1980. That's in the middle of all of this time. It's when Casey was sending out messages and when all of these things were going on. July and August were very big months in 1980. A lot was going on with the campaign and all. And anyway, they went. So he went there, and I had dinner with him after he was back, and he told me straight out. He said, I had not known that he had gone to Iran in the summer of 1980, but he did. And he said that he had talked to all of his old contacts, the high-level folks in Iran, presumably the Shah, but also the other high-level intelligence types and the like. And he came away with a one-sentence description of their situation. He said, these were not nervous men. In other words, as far as he could tell, they were all, as Ambassador Sullivan was at the same time delivering that message to the White House, because I was in the meeting with him when he told Brzezinski that basically the Shah could handle this by himself, and he was perfectly capable of taking care of it. And don't worry about it. I'll take care of this. And that was the message that was being delivered. Well, it wasn't just made up. I mean, in fact, the people in Iran, I think, didn't know how serious it was until a couple of months later, when all hell broke loose, and then they didn't know what to do, and they all collapsed. So anyway, that was so Carter had to make a decision about whether to admit the Shah. The answer is he could have had treatment in Mexico City. They had very good medical care. But Ben Keane, the doctor, and others said he's dying. He needs the best care he can possibly get. The only place you can get it is New York Hospital. And they sold that to the State Department first, and then the State Department sold it to the president, and the president very reluctantly. In his last meeting, Carter sat around with all of his top people, Secretary of State, Defense, CIA, everybody was there, and went around the room, Mondale, Vice President, and said, what do you recommend? They all said, bring in the Shah, because it was politically killing Carter to have the Shah out. And Kissinger was going around the country saying, we've cut him loose. He was an old ally, and basically now he's a man without a country. And how can we do this to him? And he was making speeches and the like. And then Kissinger doesn't like to be reminded of that now, because the Shah was admitted, and Carter did say, okay, I'll let him in, but I wonder what you're going to say when they take my people hostage in Iran. He he was aware that this could very well happen. And then they took the hostages, and you could argue that the people who argued to get the Shah into the country bore some responsibility, right? For what happened afterwards. Try to find a Rockefeller or Kissinger who will say that they have any responsibility for that. We were just making a case about our old friend, not a big deal, Anyway, that's how he got into the country. And but it was Carter, I think, would agree that it was a mistake. What was the second part?
Third part.
The third,
About the general.
Heiser's trip to Iran.
Did you know that, or it was secret?
No, Heiser was sent to Iran primarily by Carter, certainly, but certainly most of all by Brzezinski, my boss. I was working in the NSC at the time, and his job, his orders were to try to hold the military together, because it was the only institution left. Everything else had collapsed. The government, the Majlis, everything had collapsed. The Savak, you name it. There were no institutions left except the military. And that was the only hope of maintaining a government in place that was not the radical Islamist takeover that turned into what we've now got and what we see. And so Carter, those were his orders. And the reality was that by the time he got there, it was really too late. The military weren't interested in listening to Heiser. They weren't interested in anything except their own skin. And they were certainly not willing to stand up and fight for the Shah. Although if the Shah had been there, they would have. But the Shah was gone. And the Shah had, from all accounts, no additional contact with his military or anything of the sort. And basically, they ran for cover. Some of them were arrested and killed. Some of them were thrown out, resigned, and some of them ran.
I have two questions. One, there were writings in Iran, probably by the opponents of Shah, about his childhood in Switzerland when he was in high school and going to college, at how lonely young man he was. And so my question is, wasn't that something that people here in the United States should have considered about his personality, that he may not be ready to handle such a situation? I have a second question too. The same year in 1979, in October, in Pakistan, in Islamabad, US embassy was occupied for a day, I think, by the protesters and then burned. And one national staff of the US embassy was also killed. Was that in any way related to the incidents in Iran, or how was that?
With regard to your second one, I haven't looked at the dates and times and stuff very much lately, but no, this was at the time, I believe, when the fatwa was issued about what do I mean? The writer
Salman Rushdie.
Salman Rushdie, and that set off when Khomeini issued that set off all kinds of reverberations throughout the Islamic world. And that, I believe, is what led directly to.
I'm talking about the 29th of October or 28th of October 1979. It is all over the news from that period. A mob or a protest went all the way to the US Embassy in Islamabad and burned it. Actually, then the Pakistani military evacuated staff from the embassy.
I think,
It was related to
There were,
the Makkah event.
actually, our embassy in Pakistan was burned several times, so I'm confusing it, but on that particular case, I don't believe it was related to. I don't believe it was related to what we're talking about here, the revolution. With regard to the Shah's personality, it's a very interesting case because, Larosi was a very exclusive school. I'm not know how lonely he was. I mean, Richard Helms was there at the school at the same time, and they knew each other. At least they both went to that same school. I don't know that they were buddies while this was going on. There was a lot of evidence. I mean, more than going to the school in Switzerland, the Shah in 1953, when the United States and the British conspired to overthrow his to overthrow the rule of Mossadegh and put the Shah back in place, was, you know, when this was being talked about with him, he had a hard time making up his mind whether he wanted to join it or not, thought that it probably would fail, ran for cover, flew to Iraq and then on to Rome. And then when the coup actually worked and they called him back, he flew back to Iran. It said something about his personality also. He was a fairly young man at that point. We're talking 20 years later, when he has almost unlimited funds, where he has made himself into an internationally renowned statesman, where his best friend is Henry Kissinger, who praises him enormously. It says that he's one of the greatest strategists that he's ever met, and he continues to say that to this day. And he's also never told the story about what actually happened during that period that he was, when they were there. Kissinger says he's forgotten about the fact that they gave the Shah a blank check to basically get any of the arms that he wanted. Well, nobody else forgot about it. And the Shah certainly didn't forget about it. And so there was a lot of evidence that the Shah was an uncertain man. His father was big and strong and swaggering and a real tough guy. And the Shah was not a big, strong, tough guy. And clearly he grew up emulating his father or wanting to. But as I say, the way he did it was with these scripted things where he would come into a room and everything had been laid out in advance and he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he was dealing with people at a very high level. When it came to dealing with people, just people, he had no chops at all. So anyhow, but I must say, and I'm sorry, Peter, but the CIA was asked to actually do a profile of the Shah in about it was August and September of 1978, just before everything fell apart. And they on the psychological part said, well, he's got all these demonstrations going on. He has reason to be upset. You know, okay, he did. But, you know, that was not really the answer that we needed at that point. And also, people who knew him and were around him a lot, we had people would come in and out of Tehran and they would meet with the Shah, and the ambassador Sullivan would go with them. And they would come away. I remember the Secretary of the Treasury visited Tehran and came away and wrote a cable back to Washington. And he said, you know, the Shah was just a zombie. That he was there in September. He said he looked sort of vacant and as if nothing was going on. And sure enough, a day later, Ambassador Sullivan came in with a cable and said, well, the Shah was right back to his feisty, normal self today, and all was well, and so forth. Basically, Sullivan really didn't want Washington interfering with his business in Iran, and you know, it was not a good scene.
Was he a political appointee?
No, he was a professional.
Wow.
So, Ann, let me get you one more. Do you have another question remotely?
Okay. So this is from Mitchell Cohen. Your discussion of Camp David negotiations at the time of the emerging Iraq crisis leaves the impression that President Carter had a quote comprehensive approach to the Israel-Arab zone, but comprehensive understanding of the Mideast did not include the whole region, particularly Iran. Would this be a fair description?
You know, I think did he have as much knowledge about Saudi Arabia as he did about the Arab-Israel dispute? No, I don't think he did. And did he, you know, he actually visited Iran. He met with the Shah twice in that first year. He had as much introduction to the Shah as anybody usually gets if you're a president, you know. He was not, I think, you know, I'm responsible for this. You know, I was the one that was supposed to make sure that he did know about Iran. I was feeding memos on a fairly regular basis, talking about the internal politics and what was going on in the streets and how The Shah was not handling it very well. But was he as an expert on Iran as he was on, say, Israel and the Palestinians? Absolutely not. He really became the desk officer for the Arab-Israel dispute. And he knew every comma, every detail, every date, every time, and he was fully briefed on the whole thing. On Iran, he knew probably what he thought he needed to know, and it turned out that turned out to be wrong. And then when the Shah absolutely collapsed, basically in that last 2 or 3 months, it was too late to do anything about it. And that was a hard time to start catching up on what you didn't know about Iran, or what the Shah didn't want us to know about Iran, actually. Because we had agreed with Kissinger and Nixon, we had agreed basically in 1972 when they visited there and offered for him to be our protector in the Gulf, and also offered him, an open sesame to the American arms industry, with the exception of nuclear weapons. Anything up to that, the Shah could order whatever he wanted, and we wouldn't question him. We've done that with no other country ever in history, and I hope we never do again. I don't think it's a very smart thing. So our Secretary of Defense said, what? The Shah comes and says, I want the F-14, which is a carrier aircraft. The Shah doesn't have a carrier. And he says, why don't you buy the F-15, which is a really good dual purpose aircraft and would actually serve you very well. Shah said, I want the F-14, and he got it. That's another story. He was planning to get a carrier.
Yeah.
So you have the fall of Somoza over the same period, which segues to the Iran-Contra affair.
Yeah.
What role does Nicaragua policy play in this picture?
Well, only that some of this I don't know personally, so I hesitate to be in too much detail. But the reality is that at least Oliver North at one point determined that you could run a covert action that would pay for itself. You sell stuff with one hand, and then you use the money to pay the bills that you accumulated. And he looked at the fact that they were trying to support the Contras. The Congress said you are not permitted to support the Contras. Period. No question about it. But if you could earn money that on a covert action that wasn't traceable to anybody, and you could take the earnings from that and apply it to the Contras in Nicaragua, well, hooray. I mean,
You said it was pretty neat.
yeah,
He said pretty neat.
it's pretty neat. Yeah, it's pretty neat. And that's in effect what happened. And there were more people involved, and there were a lot of other things. But I think that most Americans, in effect, Oliver North sort of came into the NSC at about the same level that I was. I mean, he was a military officer. I was a military officer. We worked on the Middle East. He worked on a lot of other things as well. But it would never in a million years have occurred to me to launch a covert action with Iran and use the money to pay off somebody else without telling the Congress, who had told me not to do that. I mean, that wouldn't have occurred to me, but it did to him. And it did to a number of other people who were involved in that whole business. So, it's not a question of would you do something like this? It's how much, when, how, and so forth. It was just a matter of figuring out the details.
I have my question here. So just one clarification. Gary, that was actually not a covert action. There was no memorandum signed by President Reagan.
That's true.
It's the way it's supposed to.
It was a true covert action. It was covert, a freelance
Right out of the way.
freelance covert action.
Wouldn't it be neat?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your remarks today. My question is about the ultimately unsuccessful effort by the U.S. military to free the hostages, Operation Eagle Claw, I think it was April of '80.
Yeah.
I know there was a debate between Secretary of State Vance and National Security Advisor Brzezinski over the merits of the operation. I'd love to hear your perspective on what's going on.
Yeah, that always comes up. I mean, and it should. Again, this is a long story, and I will give you the short version. Basically, actually, it was just about this date in 1980.
Yes.
That I'd been following the whole hostage business and talking to the State Department and various other things. And it was clear at that point. I remember it because it was just about my birthday, and I had brought my sister to the White House for lunch. It was a nice little perk, and I, on my way out, my sister left, and I ran into the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who was coming in, and I said, how's the planning going? I wasn't involved in the planning, but I knew that there was planning being done about figuring out if we should ever want to do a rescue mission, we should be prepared to do it and do it right. And he said, pieces are beginning to come together, and it's looking as if, maybe it's a workable operation, because they had pretty much decided at the beginning that it just really couldn't be done. And then they started really working on it. But what they came up with was a very complicated system. And bottom line, they needed 8 helicopters. They were going to fly in with the helicopters. The helicopters would stay overnight and hidden away. Couldn't do it all in one day. So they would fly in at night. They would seclude themselves in a safe little valley with camouflage where they would hopefully go unnoticed. And then the next night, after sundown, they had troops that had come in, people that were ready to go, buses that were set, and they would, and helicopters ready to go. So the buses would go down through the streets of Tehran. People were all dressed in black, like guerrilla troops and Revolutionary Guard. They had native Iranian speakers driving the buses and talking to, if they got stopped for anything, that they would have an answer for that, and they would keep going. So they were to drive to the embassy, and at that point they would break into the embassy. They knew exactly where everybody was in the embassy and had really good information. These were graduate students who were guarding them, and they were. And so for 6 months, they had been sitting there night after night after night, doing their homework, I suppose, but with a rifle probably beside them. And on that night, it was a Sunday night, like it would be a Friday night in Iran, so their equivalent of a Sunday night. At about 2 or 3 in the morning, there would be a thump, and the lights would all go out. And then they would have about maybe a minute and a half to decide what to do. And they could take their gun, if they had one there with them, go in and start shooting hostages, which seems like pretty unlikely that they would do that, but they could have. And if they didn't, they would get shot. And they would take over the embassy completely at night, get the hostages out, move them to a nice soccer stadium next door where the helicopters would come in, pick them up, and they go home. Okay, much more complicated than that, but that's basically it. The bottom line was that the helicopters broke down before they got to all of that second side. I've always believed that if they had actually gotten in, settled into their positions for that second day, and then struck the next night, that in fact, their chances were pretty good. Everybody would be in bed. You wouldn't be driving through massive crowds in the middle of Tehran, et cetera. The people there weren't expecting it. They had no knowledge of it whatsoever. And the people and the team, the Delta Force team that was going in, was quite well trained to do that, to get to the embassy, break in, and do their job. They knew what they were supposed to do. And the U.S. was prepared to take care of them from that point on. So, I didn't think it was a crazy plan, but it was certainly risky. And it always takes a little bit of luck. And this wasn't lucky. They ran into dust storms that were invisible from the air, that you couldn't see them. They had 3 helicopters develop serious problems. They needed 6 helicopters to do the job. And they ended up with 5 at the end of it. And then they decided to call it off. And the guy there in charge said it should be aborted and told the president that. The president said, okay. And then as they refueled to fly out of there, one of the helicopters bumped into one of the aircraft and a huge fire was set off and people died. And that was the part that really, really, really hurt Jimmy Carter. And
We've got time for 2 more questions. We have about 10 minutes. I want to do one more remote and then this gentleman here. And can I have one footnote? There is a positive thing that came out of that horrible failure. When President Obama decided to do the raid on Abbottabad, it was his idea to have a 3rd helicopter as a backup. And he cited this particular case.
not only that, but our whole spatial operations now, which is wonderfully trained and all, this was the early days. This was our first real spatial ops operation, and it was pretty shaggy, you know.
Olivia, you got.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask
Okay.
2 quick ones. There should be enough time, just to get. One is, do you have any thoughts as to whether or not Reagan himself knew about or authorized the effort to delay the hostages until after Carter left office? And the second is, do you believe if the hostages were released earlier, Carter would have been reelected?
Okay, well, obviously these are both speculative. I mean, but if you give me another week, I think I will have a better answer to the first part about Reagan and what he knew. I don't now. I honestly don't know whether he knew or not. Generally, people's campaigns don't go off and do wild and crazy things without the people at the top knowing it. They may not want their fingerprints on it, but they're generally informed one way or the other. Bill Casey was a very spatial guy, and he was quite capable of doing all. His best friends all say, you know, this guy, he was crazy, and he was willing to do anything, and you could never stop him, and you could never outguess him, and you know, and he was the campaign manager. So did he brief Reagan about all of this stuff that he was doing? As I say, I'm hoping, this is still an ongoing process. I hope within a week that I'll maybe have a little better answer to that question, but I really don't know. And what was the second question?
If Carter would have been reelected.
Oh, would he have been reelected? I have talked to people who were running the campaign and people who were watching the campaign closely, and they disagree. Some people say if you had had a big surge of really good news right at that last minute, say between October 31st and November 4th, that because the polls had been very even, and that late October they started to break toward Reagan, would that have stopped the break? And other people who were watching it very closely and who really know what they're talking about say they think it probably was all over at that point. Maybe if you'd solved the problem a month earlier, that could have been used to your benefit, but just at the last second, they didn't think so. So take your pick. You know, if depending on what you believe and what your ideology is and what your politics are, you can take your pick, and it's okay.
Sir.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Stick, for speaking with us. I have 2 quick questions if time permits.
Everybody has.
The first has to do with like the inevitability of the revolution. I know there's some with the.
I'm sorry.
The first question has to do with the inevitability of the revolution. I think there's like some scholars that Abrahamian is one of them. He argues that, you know, even the event of 1979 was completely a linear event from 53, and something like the hostage crisis was a natural expression of it. How do you, think that fits into your argument? And the second one, I'm sure you've maybe heard this. A lot of Iranian Americans unilaterally blame Carter for, essentially removing the Shah from power.
Imagine that.
Um,
I've never heard such a thing.
I don't necessarily, I don't.
No,
buy
no,
into
it's
it.
okay. You don't have,
No, I don't buy into it at all, but
no,
I
look,
want to know, where do you think?
just about every Iranian in this country believes in their heart that Jimmy Carter overthrew the Shah and replaced him with Khomeini. And I'm not joking. I mean, because never mind, but basically the answer to that, of course, is no. I mean, Carter had absolutely no desire to see the Shah overthrown. He definitely didn't like Khomeini at all, and I heard him actually use some pretty rough language.
I didn't mean to ask that. I meant to ask, where's the origins of this?
No,
Because
it's
this
no, no, it's
I hear.
no, I know.
And
I'm sort of joking about it because this is one of the things that just stunned me when I first started giving talks, and I wrote that I was on book talks and immediately began, especially in California, where the diaspora people are the Iranian diaspora is heavily in California. And I got there and was giving book talks, and this question immediately came, but didn't Jimmy Carter really want to get rid of the Shah and provide and replace him with Khomeini? And I discovered this was so incredible to me. I mean, that anybody could even imagine this.
Fake news.
And
well,
but they did. And I've discovered that this is like a number of other things. It's like, did Brzezinski order the Saddam Hussein to attack Iran?
yes.
Everybody believes that. Okay, didn't happen. It really didn't happen, and it didn't have to happen. Saddam had his own reasons for wanting to do this, and did. And I was with Brzezinski the morning that it happened, and when they attacked, and he was surprised. Okay, anyway, but the origin of it, probably to be unfair to the people doing it, a lot of the people who really came up with this were people who ran. They were supporters of the Shah, and many of them worked with the court, and they left. They didn't do anything. They didn't stay there. They didn't fight. They didn't do, and they say now they really support the Shah and they're all on his side, but they didn't fight. They didn't do anything. And I think they're ashamed of themselves.
But there is something more subtle in your story. I just want to press you on this, a more subtle version of Carter wanted to overthrow the Shah, because you argue that there was a massive intelligence failure. Bob Jervis argued there was a massive intelligence failure. And that sounds very consequential, a massive intelligence failure. They didn't see the revolution coming. So the implication always for me, as an outsider, as Asia, just looking at this, is that if we had only known about the revolution, the US could have taken a different policy that could have prevented it, which is different than overthrowing the Shah intentionally. It's like, we blew it. Right? You can blow it by not knowing and not being, prepared to deal with it.
Well, I mean, my book is named "All Fall Down."
No, it's all bad.
I mean, I didn't write that title because I thought we did everything perfectly.
No. But the implication is if we had known everything more in advance,
If
maybe
we had
we
known-
could have done something to prevent the revolution. But
If
maybe
I-
that's not true.
Well, I think it may not be true. That basically, in my view, having thought about it a lot for 50 years, 40 years, I would say certainly that if we were going to stop the revolution in its tracks, what we would have had to do is basically go to the Shah, Carter, go to the Shah and say, look, your system is breaking down. You're going to have to take severe action. You need to arrest the people who are the leaders of this thing. You need to be able to massively show force so that the demonstrations will be broken up. And then you're going to have to do some political reforms after things settle down, and give him that order. His own people gave him exactly that advice twice. And the Shah didn't pay any
So
attention.
we couldn't have changed things then.
So basically, I don't, and if you can imagine Jimmy Carter going in to the Shah and saying, maybe you ought to get really nasty with your own people and
Yeah,
have
that
guns
wasn't
out
very
on the
Jimmy
street.
Carter.
Somehow I find that a little preposterous.
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Afghanistan in that year on this situation.
What about Afghanistan? I mean,
It's the
the
same time that the
December 1979.
December 79, where the Russians invaded Afghanistan and the hostages were there. We were in negotiations trying to sort out the problem. The hostages, we still thought that they might shoot the hostages. We didn't know. I mean, it was becoming fairly clear that they probably wouldn't. Carter had really warned them if they harmed any of the hostages, there would be hell to pay, and they took that seriously. And they quit. They just pulled back and quit aggravating them. They quit doing, mock trials and all of this kind of stuff. And the whole talk about trials for the hostages died. But beyond that, so we boycotted the Olympics, and there was a lot of thought that in fact the Soviets were going to use Afghanistan as a staging point to then go on to the Gulf. And the fact that we had lost Iran as a client state made that somewhat more believable. And it was certainly taken seriously by my boss, and I think Carter to a considerable degree as well, but a lot of other people too. And anybody who had a Cold War vein in their body was taking that seriously. I think, in fact, it was never a threat. That basically the Russians now, when you hear the people that were involved in that decision making with Brezhnev at the time, were appalled that he invaded Afghanistan. They didn't think they were up to it, and they just thought that this was going to. And Brzezinski thought it was wonderful on one side because he could see Vietnam written all over that, and so they would go in and we would just bleed them to death, and they would go in. So from his point of view, but did they plan to go on the Russians? No. Might they have if they had been tremendously successful and taken over Afghanistan? They might then have started looking beyond. But when they came in, that was not on anybody's mind.
So the irony of your question, though, is if you read the Politburo minutes that have been published, you now can see everything about the Soviet decision making. At the end of the day, literally 4 Soviet leaders made this decision against the advice of the Chief of the General Staff, Garkov. And the logic was the Russians had gotten information that a US CIA officer had been in contact with the head of the Afghan regime, and the Russians were worried the Americans
We're going to turn him up.
we're going to turn Afghanistan into their new client state because we have just lost Iran. The irony here is just rich.
The CIA is always behind that, of course.
On the Afghanistan thing, I would quote one of the Mujahideen leaders who was already in Pakistan before the Soviet invasion. He had left during the 70s, during the Daud Khan presidency. Hikmatyar, he has written a book that when Soviets were getting ready to invade, he asked the American consulate official in Peshawar to have a meeting with him, and they met him. And he provided all the evidence that they're preparing. This is according to him. He has said 2 things. One, that American didn't believe me. Second, they didn't take it serious. The counselor said that we will stop the grain supply to Soviet Union, and smiled about it and left the meeting.
Yeah, well, as I think everybody can tell, this is a story that doesn't end. And there are infinite questions, there are infinite issues, and it never stops. But in any case, I think we probably should, because